Rizzi, do you renounce Satan?
I do renounce him. I do renounce him.
Michael Rizzi, will you be baptized?
The film you just saw, The Godfather, was based on the Italian-American Mafia and was an accurate representation of Mafia violence at the time. Realistically, Michael Corleone was never going to be arrested for his murders, since he hired people to do them for him. Legally, he was not involved. At the time, the law stated that you had to be directly involved with the crime to prosecute criminals. That changed on October 15, 1970. Signed into law by President Richard Nixon, the Racketeering Influence and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act went into effect and greatly assisted the FBI in arresting and prosecuting criminals and organizations. The RICO Act is a federal law that allows criminal penalties and civil actions against criminal networks. If you're connected to individuals involved in racketeering and bribery, you could be prosecuted and taken to court. Using this, the RICO Act was and still is used to prosecute criminal organizations as conspiracies, making it an important turning point in U.S. history. What made it so?
Hit it!
In the mid-1900s, the mob ruled all. They had their finger in everyone's pie, so to speak. They controlled construction, gambling, waste disposals, and unions. Heck, even grocery stores were unsafe. So how did this happen, and why did the government let it happen in the first place? The story begins in the early 1930s during the Castellamarese War. For context, Mussolini had forced mafiosi out of Italy. Those mafiosi ended up going to the United States, where there were foreign gangs around bootlegging and other businesses. The largest of these gangs was headed by Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria. Masseria was known for his extremely violent manner. Despite that, he had a keen eye for picking talented underlings. 3 of his recruits would become instrumental in shaping the Italian-American Mafia. Salvatore Lucania would become Charles Lucky Luciano, founder of the Luciano and eventually Genovese crime family. Francesco Castiglia would become Frank Costello and would also eventually head the Luciano family. Gaetano Lucchese would change his first name to Thomas and become the founder of the Lucchese crime family. The Castellamarese Salvatore Maranzano would arrive in the United States in 1925, joining the ranks of the already established Castellamarese crime within mafia circles. He was an already established mafioso and quickly began setting up operations with the NYC. He also began working with a young Joseph Marano, the man who had come to head the Maranzano and eventually Marano crime family. In 1930, chaos erupted. Masseria began demanding tributes, recognizing his position as head of New York mafiosi from rival gangs. This angered the Castellamarese faction, especially Maranzano. Masseria would send hitmen after Castellamarese soldiers, but Maranzano still refused to submit. The violence would eventually culminate into the Castellamarese War, one of the most important events in Italian-American mafia history. During the war, Charles Lucky Luciano, one of Masseria's top lieutenants, recognized that the whole affair would draw unwanted attention to mafia affairs and would disrupt current mafia business interests. Not only this, but Luciano was becoming increasingly discontent with Masseria's refusal to branch out into other areas of business. As such, he decided to meet with Maranzano and Bonanno to end the war. In exchange for Maranzano recognizing Luciano as a legitimate boss and withdrawal of Castellamarese hitmen, Luciano would arrange for the assassination of Masseria. On April 15, 1931, he did exactly just that. However, Maranzano would renege on the agreement and declare himself capo di tutti capi, or boss of all bosses. As such, he too was assassinated under Luciano's orders on September 10, 1931. After this, Luciano would unveil his most important creation, the Commission. The Commission was to be the governing body of the Mafia all around the US. It was to be headed by La Cosa Nostra, or the 5 families of New York City, the Arm, or the Magaddino family of Buffalo, New York, and the Chicago Outfit. The 5 families would come to dominate New York City. Over the years, these 5 families came to control politicians, police, judges, and union leaders at the expense of average citizens. They controlled vital businesses such as construction and waste management. They committed various crimes while going unpunished. That is the most important part. The family heads were essentially invincible. No crime could be traced back to them because they never committed any crimes. That was how the Mafia managed to create a chokehold on New York commerce. Thus, for years, the Mafia went unharmed and unrestricted due to loopholes in the law, much to the frustration of the FBI. That would change in 1970 when Congress passed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. This would allow law enforcement to arrest additional persons under the doctrine of respondeat superior. During the 1980 to 2000 period, the RICO statute was used by federal prosecutors to bring several Mafia figures to justice. From February 1985 to November 1986, the Mafia Commission trial took place. During this trial, 11 figures of organized crime, including the patriarchs of the 5 families, were indicted by U.S. Attorney Rudolph Giuliani under the RICO Act. Their charges included extortion, labor racketeering, narcotic trafficking, and loan sharking. Before the trial ended, Constantino Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino family, was assassinated. It was planned and carried out by John Gotti with the help of the Lucchese family boss, Anthony Corallo. The assassination was unsanctioned and happened mainly due to Castellano not sending his late underboss's weight, naming Thomas Bellotti, an incompetent loyalist with little diplomatic skill, as the new underboss of the Gambino crime family, and threatening to break up Gotti's crew. Eventually, 8 defendants were convicted of racketeering, and 1 defendant, Indelicato, was convicted of murder. Anthony Salerno, Antonio Corallo, and Carmine Ferrer-Sico, who were the bosses of the Genovese, Lucchese, and Colombo families respectively, were all fined and sentenced to prison. All 3 of them would die in federal custody. However, through a mobster turned informant to the FBI, the government learned that Salerno was a front for the real boss of the Genovese family, Vincent the Chin Gigante. Gigante would go on to be recognized as the most powerful and dangerous crime boss in the United States following the arrest of Gotti and other Gambino family members. Astonishingly, for about 30 years, Gigante feigned insanity to prevent himself from being prosecuted. This would earn him the nickname the Oddfather. Eventually, the government found out about the sham and sentenced Gigante to 12 years in prison in 1997 for conspiracy racketeering, and an additional 3 years in prison from 2003 for obstruction of justice charges. Because of RICO, the Mafia was dealt a blow that they never fully recovered from, and the New York City Mafia will never be the same.
So what are we going to do here, folks? I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break.
On January 2, 2021, Donald J. Trump phoned Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find him 11,000 votes. Even after a statewide recount, Trump remained bewildered by his loss. Trump repeatedly requested Raffensperger to add 11,780 votes to win the election by 1. Trump pressured Raffensperger by suggesting that he and his team could face criminal liability if they didn't comply, which was false. Trump used threatening language, false claims of fraud, and pressure to break the law to make Raffensperger change the count, despite Raffensperger repeatedly stating it was accurate. Although Trump's name isn't under the indictment, prosecutors could attempt to use the phone call and other pieces of information and evidence to connect him to the conspiracy, pressuring state officials' attempts to appoint illegitimate electors and making false statements of voter fraud represent a pattern of racketeering targeted at overturning the 2020 election results. The conspiracy also allegedly involved calls and travels across state lines, so it could affect interstate commerce, fulfilling a key requirement for RICO charges. Trump's indictment would prove that no one is above the law and that the RICO Act demonstrates this perfectly as a turning.
Then, of course, RICO was never intended to be only used against the Mafia. It was used against many criminal enterprises, some of which you probably wouldn't even expect to be involved in. One of the most infamous applications of RICO was in June of 1984. The Key West Police Department was indicted and put on trial for running a criminal enterprise racket. According to that evidence, the Key West Police Department was protecting drug smugglers who were selling cocaine under their protection. Of course, this didn't end well, and the police chief ended up with 30 years along with 12 other colleagues. Another famous case was in 2015, when the DOJ formally indicted FIFA, naming 14 people as the defendants. In the document, they claimed that FIFA executives at the highest level, most notably Sepp Blatter, the president of FIFA at the time, was accepting bribes to bias the World Cup towards certain countries. As a result of this investigation, Sepp Blatter stepped down and most of the defendants pleaded guilty. However, since it was FIFA, a major sports organization with lots of power, they were never arrested nor faced any jail time. Instead, they simply were forced to leave FIFA. Before RICO, prosecutors could not target the entire enterprise as an entity. It was burdensome to dismantle mob operations and conspiracies because the individual members could always be replaced. But ever since its passing in 1970, RICO redesigned the fight against mob crimes, bringing down powerful mafias and playing havoc with conspiracies. It not only stopped mafias such as the Five Families and Tracks, but was also applied to other corrupt organizations as well, such as the Cowboy Mafia and the Key West Police Department. The RICO Act was an extremely crucial development in American law. However, the future remains a mystery. With cybercrime, international network threats, and the ongoing Trump investigation, RICO may be used as an effective tool against crime. Only time and our decisions will tell. But for now, the US is a safer place thanks to one law that changed everything.